and welcome to Devlog number 33. We're well into phase 5 right now, which is really exciting because it means we're actually getting to the end of major mechanics implementation. The last two major things that really need to be implemented from scratch are planets, which shouldn't be that bad because I do a lot of reusability in my code, and planets are really just going to be stations with restrictions on what's able to dock at them. And then actually making the skirmish battles occur at maps that make sense for where they're occurring on the strategic map. You've probably noticed at this point that all the conquest battles that I've had in the background of these videos have been taking place on random maps like Caltrop, which isn't even present in the Akota system. And the reason that I've done that is just for the sake of the testers. They have some interesting battle terrain to fight on, and they don't just have to fight abyssal battles over and over and over again. But I've got cool plans for both of those things, and I'm not going to get into it now because that's going to be the next devlog, and I don't want to spoil anything. That's just major mechanics that need to be done from scratch, though. There's still going to be plenty of development work to do when it comes to fleshing out all of the existing stuff, fixing bugs, tuning things, and balance, etc. But in terms of what's actually been done in the last few months, and I apologize that it's been almost 3 months since I posted a devlog, I've been really hard at work on all this stuff. The first thing that we have to talk about, because I can't show you anything else without spoiling this one, is a major overhaul to the whole Conquest UI. I have made no secret of the fact that I think that the Dev Conquest UI is really ugly. I like the mood of it and the simplicity of it, but in terms of how it looked, it's just very bad. It had bad visual hierarchy. It was just white box nested within white box nested within white box. And that's okay for dev work, but it's not what I want to push out to the players, especially because Conquest is so heavily focused on UI interactions that I don't want you just staring at something ugly all the time while you're playing. So some of you may know that I'm friends with Todd, the developer of Falling Frontier, and I asked him for some advice because his UI just looks so good, and he hooked me up with a friend of his who's a very talented UI designer named Josh. So I sat down with him, showed him the existing UI, talked about my goals, what kind of mood that I wanted with it, what the functionality needed to be, and then he went and made this. I really love this design. It's got the same efficient, clean look that I was going for with the development graphics, but it's just so much easier on the eyes with the nice soft grays and the way that the boxes are nested within each other. It's got color use in just the right places with some orange accents on some of the major buttons. The pull-down menus have this nice little orange highlight in the corner that matches the buttons that turn them on. And overall, I just think the whole design manages to be sleek and attractive and realistic and not overbearing like a lot of science fiction game UIs are. And because everything just looks so much better, I'll take a minute here to just flip through a couple of windows that you'd be familiar with from previous devlogs so you can see how they've changed and how much better they look. So here's the update to the ship information window. The only thing that really stands out here as jarring is the green color, and the reason for that is that these colors get drawn from our colorblind palette. Josh's original concepts had some colors that were more muted and fit with the rest of the design, but because it all draws from the same colorblind palette, I need to make sure that those colors are going to work in the skirmish game as well, and we're working on that right now before I can update the normal mode of the colorblind palettes, although the colorblind mode colors are not going to change. Here's the new station information window with its new tab system, and then the officer information display. There's also a much cleaner layout for the shipping routes where things are not just a giant wall of text anymore. A really big and positive changes to the berth scheduler, which is just way more legible now. I've also finally added a really important feature to this window, which is the ability to drag and drop things to reschedule. So down at the bottom, we've got this list of unscheduled ships, which are ships that are in port but do not have any work scheduled for them. Previously, if you wanted to schedule work for these ships, you'd need to take them out of port and then put them back into port for the berth that you wanted them to do work on. But now we can just drag ships from this list onto the berth schedule, and we can also drag them around to reorder the ordering of ships in a specific berth or transfer them to other berths by dragging them there. This is a huge quality of life improvement for anyone who's doing depot management or logistics stuff, and the testers were very happy when I added it. The replenishment planner for task forces also works the same way now, which is just a lot more intuitive than it was before, where you're checking boxes for what ships you want to fuel and reload. On the non-graphic design side, there's also a new UI decluttering algorithm that I've added. So previously, all these 4 cargo ships would have been sitting on top of each other, but now the icons will push away from nearby icons so they're not all sitting on top of each other. Though there's obviously still some improvements that need to be made when it comes to the icons jittering around. Another tool to declutter the map even further is the addition of these little icon collapsing trees that you can see here. What these do is that whenever the sphere of influence of a planet is smaller than a certain size on the screen, the icons in that SOI get collapsed into this tree. And it works recursively, so as we pull out more, we can see that all of the icons around Jules Rest get grouped here. The clusters distinguish between major and minor icons, so it can be really easy to see what units are at a location, and then the smaller ones are stations and cargo ships. I can also right-click any of the icons in this group and interact with it through the context menu, so I don't need to zoom in. And for some final exciting UI-related news, we're going to be updating the Skirmish UI with a new look and feel as well. And that's going to be done on the main branch, which means you're going to get your hands on it either in the next minor update or the one after that, because it's easier for me to implement that change on the main branch and merge it down into Conquest instead of having to merge it later. Alright, that was a lot on UI, but as I said, Conquest is very UI-centric, so the UI really matters a lot here. But now let's talk about actual game mechanics, and first up is the intel system. Mechanically, the intel system in this skirmish game is really bare bones. But whether you realize it or not, when you're playing a skirmish game, you're constantly doing tactical intelligence assessments, and that's very deep. Where's the enemy? What's their disposition? What's still online? How much ammo or missiles do they still have left? What's their next move going to be? What point are they going to go for? The problem is that even though Nebulous moves at a rather lumbering pace, it's still not easy to create any kind of interface for that kind of gameplay because everything's happening so quickly. You're doing these assessments on the fly in your head. But because of the much slower turn-based strategy pace of the Conquest game, I had an opportunity to create a lot of interfaces to make it so that you can do the in-depth strategic intelligence analysis of what the enemy's going to do and show it to your teammates through the interface. Because I wanted to make sure that Intel was more of a metagame that relies on player knowledge and skill and decision rather than just roll some dice and get intelligence on where the enemy's going to be. First up for Intel is the enemy order of battle list, which is a list of all of the enemy ships that you know about. Because Conquest is kind of predicated on the idea that these two nations have been staring at each other for a while, their navies are not entirely unknown to each other. So you'll start with basic knowledge of what ship classes the enemy has in their initial navy. And then depending on the ship's size, you'll get more or less accurate information on the actual hull numbers and names. Ships that are flagship capable, you'll get almost perfect knowledge on the number of ships and their names, because these are well-known ships that do parades and they're public affairs kind of things. But as you go down the list and you get into smaller and smaller hulls that are more numerous, the numbers get less accurate. This is just the basic implementation of the order of battle list, so eventually you'll be able to edit the designs or what you think they are, determine their engine configuration, what weapons they have, that kind of stuff. But for now, you've just got a list of specific ships associated with a hull or a class. You can add new classes for specific hull types, you can add ships to existing classes, you can change their names if you want to, but by default it's going to give them a phonetic name. You can also edit the names and numbers of individual ships, and you can also use this as kind of a scorecard keeping track of what ships you've destroyed by marking them destroyed in the list. Having a list of ships is great, but how do we actually make use of it on the map? Up until now, the tracks have just been an indicator of position of an enemy force, and you really didn't know anything about them beyond the strength, the number of ships present. But now if we open up the show info window for this track, we're presented with intel imagery. All the ships are just randomly scattered around right now because the AI doesn't use the initial formations, but if it did, then they would be in the formations that you'd see them in battle. Which looks really cool, especially in the flare photo. We don't actually have a flare photo for this track because we haven't seen it on the move, but if we go to this unevaluated contact over here, we can see that we've got a 1 dry flare and a strength of 1. So you'll get a flare photo for any track that you've seen on the move, and you'll get a SAR photo or synthetic aperture radar for any track that you've seen in radar range. Eventually there's going to be a dry flare identification minigame for whichever ship you have selected, where you can determine the dry flare based on what type of hull it is, as well as maybe some modifiers based on the engine configuration. And then for the synthetic aperture radar images, you can click on the icons for the individual ships and you can see a zoomed in image of the ship. I can also edit the track from here the same way that I did in the old track info window. So I know that this is definitely hostile, so let's just mark it hostile real quick. And now this definitely looks like an Axford to me, so now we can start identifying the ship. I know that the enemy team only has one Axford type, which is the Atlas class, so I'm going to pick that, and then I don't really know what the ship is, but I'll just pick this unknown class number 17. Now I can apply that and it'll show up on the zoomed in image, but I can also go back to the enemy order of battle list and I can see that the unidentified Atlas class number 17 is now associated with track Siren number 1 and it's in orbit over Garnet. So as your intel officers on your team build up the enemy contact picture, you can start to see where all the ships are, where you've encountered them last, where they might be, what's been destroyed, etc. Now, the only way to really confirm the identity of a ship is to see it in battle, and so now the battle reports come with an additional intel report which you can access here. Now, this intel report here is basically empty because this is just a battle that I went into and then immediately declared myself the winner to test something that we're going to talk about in a second. So every ship that I encountered in the battle would show up somewhere in this report, whether I just identified its type or if I actually visually confirmed that that number 17 ship that I labeled earlier, what its actual name was, then I can see in this report and I can correct it in the list. And the reason you see the distinction between auto versus manual in the order of battle is because this report is going to get automatically applied to the track, so you don't need to go through the tedium of updating everything. The really interesting thing about this system is that the identities that you apply to the ships in the track analysis window actually apply in the skirmish game as well. It actually uses the same system that the masquerade uses, so the identity that you apply to the ship is actually a masquerade layer on top of anything that this ship has. So when I detect this ship, it's going to show up as the number 17 that I selected. Furthermore, this means that your intel officers can actually really screw you by labeling a Reigns as a Solomon or vice versa. Oh, and the missile cam is gone in Conquest, so you can't just confirm it by firing a scouting missile. If you end up encountering a track for battle that you haven't actually had a chance to analyze yet, you're not going to be totally in the dark. At the battle prompt, you're now going to get a list of all of the enemy tracks that are present, as well as any intel photos that you have of them. You can then click on any of those photos to get a blown up view of it. You can zoom and pan around in it so that you're not going to be totally in the dark as to what you're facing when you're making the decision of whether to accept or run from battle. Once battle's been accepted and you're going to prepare for assigning ships to each player, you're at that point going to know which track the enemy has selected. The reason for that is that at this point, you should be able to see which track is actually closing on your fleet and which one you're actually going to fight, and so it'll be shown over here, and you can also see the photos in this screen as well. The other new intel mechanic is communications intelligence, so basically this is a list of intercepted messages that the enemy has transmitted. There's really nothing here right now because this is only the second turn and not a lot has happened, but we do have one intercepted message, which is the situation report, which every enemy unit will send once per day. This gives us a lot of really good information. We know what the unit's name is, we know where it is in orbit over Ruby, we know how many warships and how many auxiliaries there are, and we also get this list of all the ships' names, hull numbers, fuel status, ammunition status, and at the very bottom, we also get the name of the commanding officer and what ship they're on. So if you want to try to kill their flagship, now you know which one it is. I said a long time ago that I wanted to do the naval message format for a lot of this stuff, not only because of the immersion factor and the realism factor, but because it would enable this system down the line, and now I've finally gotten to it. There are a lot of different types of messages that are going to fly around. There's these daily sit reps. Every time a unit receives new orders, there's a chance that it could be intercepted so you can see where they're going to go next. Every time a cargo ship departs, it's going to send a departure report along with its manifest and its destination. And then there's more messages that I'm going to add later on to enhance this even more. Right now there's a base 5% chance for every message that's transmitted that it's going to be intercepted by the enemy, but there's going to be ways to modify that later. Moving on, the capture mechanics up to this point have just been win a battle at the point of interest and it's yours. That was never the way it was meant to be. It was just a placeholder until I got to the actual capture mechanics. There were definitely some people who were disappointed when I announced in a previous devlog that we were not going to be having a Marines major update, but we are still going to be getting Marines at the strategic level, even if you're not going to be able to board ships with them in skirmish. This is the Nakano-class heavy troop landing ship that I teased as the other unrevealed Alliance hull in the last devlog. It's another really large ship, but not very heavily armored, only meant to carry lots of Marines and get them to where they need to go. It's got these big landing feet on the bottom that extend out, and it's also the only ship in Nebulous that's designed to enter the atmosphere, which is why it has these gigantic vertical thrusters on the sides. The way that this ship is kind of intended to work is that it would land on a planet, deploy all of its Marines through these big side doors, and then stay there as kind of a mobile command post. It's also got these landing pads up top here as kind of a future nod to the Carriers update, because I thought it would be nice if, since this ship is meant to serve as a ground base, if it could have the ability to carry some small number of spacecraft so it can have a purpose in battle as well. We talk sometimes about the quote-unquote birth defects that a lot of our ships have that make them interesting. And the Nakano has an interesting one because it's got this spinning radar up top, and then it's got this landing radar on the bottom that lets it see where it's going, but it's got nothing on the back. Because this is not meant to be a mainline combat ship, so it's missing a large portion of its radar coverage. All in all, I just really love the design of this ship. It just screams big, chonky landing ship, and it just does it really well. Though this is actually not the first concept that we had for the landing ship. This is actually a design that I made all the way back in 2008 that we updated to fit with NEBULOUS. The original design was actually pretty heavily based on modern LPD ships. I thought that would be interesting because, well, people in the Navy know what they are and how important they are and how big of a role they play in what we do. I don't think the average person, even the average Navy nerd, really understands amphibious ships at all. So I thought it would be kind of interesting to introduce people to it through this, but we worked on the design for a while, and no matter what we did, I just really wasn't happy with it. It had this persistent problem whereas every ship in NEBULOUS is very clearly a spaceship that has some wet Navy influences, this landing ship concept was explicitly a Navy ship that we had turned into a spaceship, and it just didn't fit with everything else. So after not being able to make that work for a while, we threw it out, and I dug out a really old hard drive that had this concept model on it, and we touched it up and updated it, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. Like the Mercator, the primary role of the Nakano is on the strategic map. You can see here that Garnet is contested, which means that I won a battle at the Orbit POI, so now I have free reign over the other POIs, and I've also just won a battle at Navmag Garnet, the station. If I resume the turn execution, the landing prompt is going to pop up immediately. We can see now that we're going to initiate a landing at Navmag Garnet, and that it has a marine capacity of 3,000 on 2 fronts, and the combat unit size is company. I can use as many landing ships as there are fronts, so there are 2 landing zones here, and I have the 2 landing ships that participated with me in the battle. Important to note is that you can only initiate a landing right after a battle if you have the troop ships with you during the battle. Each of these ships carries 8,000 troops, which is way more than the 3,000 marine capacity that the station has, so I'm just not going to be able to unload all of them. If I were to decline the landing, then the station would remain in enemy hands, and then I'd have to win another battle here, or there have to be no enemy units present in order for me to start landing again. But instead, I'm going to select to deploy from both of these ships, and I'm going to begin the landing process. And then the ground battle is going to immediately begin. So let's pause here and we can talk about what's actually happening. Anyone who's played Stellaris is going to recognize this immediately, but there are a few key differences. Just like in Stellaris, we have attacker and defender reserves as well as the front lines that are actually fighting. What's different here is that there are different unit sizes. So in the Defender Reserves, there's a battalion of 1,000, and then there are 4 companies on the front line of 250 each. The reason for that is that the combat unit size here is company, and that's meant to simulate that in the confined, tight spaces of a space station, there's only so much room for Marines to actually engage each other. You can't stick an entire battalion in a hallway and have them shoot at each other. And that means that when reinforcements come to the front, that battalion is going to get split up into companies and they're going to move as a unit. The other major difference is that, unlike in Stellaris where all the armies appear on the ground at once, the unloading process here actually takes time. Marines come off the troop transports and they're immediately in contact with the enemy until the front lines are filled and the reserves start building up. This creates some interesting compounding effects because the way that combat works is that every simulation step, one of all of the units at a given front are going to be selected to actually do damage to the enemy unit. And that probability is based on the size of the unit, and also the defenders get a 2 times multiplier. Combining all those factors, during the initial unloading process when there's only 1 attacking unit at the front versus 2 defending units, it means that there's a 4 times chance that the defenders are going to be doing damage to the attackers. And it really drives in the idea that these defenders are dug in and the attacking force is really in an uphill battle. The initial landing process up until a foothold is established, and sometimes even after that, can be very bloody and costly for the attackers, and fittingly so, I think. In the number of test battles that I ran with the 2,000 defenders on the station, the attacking team ended up usually losing between 4,400 and 4,600 Marines. There's a lot of room for emergent drama here, which I think is really neat. It's not just how quickly do I want the progress bar to advance. Planets are going to work the same way as this, although there's going to be more fronts and larger combat unit sizes, so you'll have regiment versus regiment, for example. You can manage your troop ships and your station garrisons through the Garrison tab in the Station Information window. Every station is going to start with a defending force based on the type of station. We can see this station has 3,000 capacity and 1,000 Marines on board. I can drag this slider to set what the minimum garrison is, so that when I'm loading Marines onto ships, I'm not going to leave it defenseless. It's never going to drop below that number. Down in the list of docked troop carriers, I can choose whether I want to make no changes or if I want to disembark Marines or embark Marines from or to this ship. And if I have a bunch docked, I can use these buttons at the top to make no transfers, disembark all, embark all. A few minor things just to finish off here. You may have noticed that even though this is only turn 3, there are a lot of cargo ships that are already underway. Because the logistics lines are so long, there's a lot of inertia in them. That has a benefit where if you lose a mine, you still have all those ships en route, so you're not going to lose everything. But it also has the downside in that it takes a long time for the industry to really get going in the start of a new game. So what I've done is I've taken the start time of the game and I've backwards simulated to figure out, given how long this logistics route is, how many cargo ships would have been in flight up to this particular time. That makes it so you don't need to wait 15 to 20 days just for your first ore ships to arrive and wait for your industry system to spin up. And at the top, there's now a cargo ship availability breakdown. I said in the last devlog about logistics that cargo ships will be spawned and despawned as needed, and that's still the case. You don't need to worry about where each individual one is. But without some kind of limitation on the number of ships that you have, there's no incentive to not just set every single route to be every 1 day, and that just results in so many ships on the map that it gets ridiculous. When we look at the great power scenario logistics chains, the problem becomes immediately apparent. The ships you're seeing here is with one departing every 5 days, so imagine 5 times more ships than this. It's still not quite as dense as what real-life shipping lanes look like, but for the purpose of a video game, it is a lot of clutter and there's a lot going on, so I may increase the storage capacity of the ships even more and reduce them even further. I also updated the shipyard manager to be way more usable, so now you've got a list of your shipyards on the left and a quick summary of what all their berth statuses are. The icons and the colors will vary based on whether the berth's occupied and what it's doing. I can expand the construction queues for each berth individually and queue up what ship I want to build in that berth, whereas previously it would just pick whichever one had the lowest occupancy, and I figured that people would probably want to have a little more control than that. I can add build orders to the queue with this pop-out blueprint list, which is a lot more readable than the sidebar that I had before, and it also shows you the material requirements as well. Overall, just 1,000 times better than the old one. And finally, command ability. Previously, task forces were capped at 20 ships maximum, period. This was a hard control to make sure that battles didn't get too out of hand, to limit death stacking, that kind of stuff. But the major downside to that is that when you're limited to 20 hulls, not any kind of measure of combat power, you're heavily incentivized to maximize the number of large, heavy-hitting hulls that you have, like battleships and heavy cruisers. And that's not what I think most people want. People want diverse, interesting fleet comps that have lots of interesting interplay, rather than just driving a blob of 5 battleships around. It's just not fun. So I got rid of the hard cap and I implemented what I'm calling command ability. If we take a look at TF Hawthorne here, we can see that we have 32 out of 56 command ability used. If we take a look at the Commodore who's in charge of this fleet, we can see that she has a command level of 6, which means that she gets 8 points for every level, so that plus the base 8 that a normal group gets, you get 56. Each individual hull type has a command requirement associated with it, so you can have more smaller ships which have less command requirement than a single large ship does. TF Hemlock also requires 32 command, so if we merge these two groups together, we can now see that we have 64 as our command requirement out of only 62 available. And we can merge even more ships in here if we want, as an example, just to make this group even bigger. And you can see that the game isn't going to limit you on how many ships you can have in a group now. But that number is yellow for a reason, so if we try to take this group over to another planet, we can see that the unit has grown beyond the command ability of this commanding officer, and there's going to be a delay in how long it takes to execute these orders now. It's not that punishing right now, though it could be increased if necessary, but it's more of a soft control, just to incentivize you to not make such big groups. That's about all I wanted to cover in this devlog. It's really exciting to have this game mode getting so close to being fully formed. It's been really neat to see almost all the mechanics that I wrote up in the original concept document finally in the game and interacting and how they work together. We're getting really close to actually starting real balance testing, and that's exciting but also very troubling because balancing this is going to be really hard. But for now, we forge on with features, so thanks for watching.